So take a few moments to check your body and mind. So do your best to be in a position that's both comfortable and relaxed, but also conducive for meditation, keeping your back straight. And if there are thoughts in your mind related to other things, past, future, other places, and so on, put them aside for now. And really do your best to stay focused on what we're doing here during this session. Bring your mind back if it does wander away. So yesterday we were looking at the self-centered attitude, this attitude that thinks I am more important than everyone else. I am like the center of the world, the center of the universe. So this is something quite deep and pervasive in our mind. And if we aspire to attain enlightenment, to be successful in the practice of the Bodhisattva path, this is one of the biggest obstacles that needs to be overcome. And it's based on a wrong conception of I. So we all have a sense that there is an I or me or myself somewhere inside of us. We don't have a clear idea what it is, but it just seems to be there. And often it's kind of subtle. But when we get emotional, when strong emotions come up like anger or fear or strong desire or excitement, at those times, this sense of a real, solid I becomes more obvious, more apparent. And probably most people never question this I. Does it exist or not? It seems to be there, so it must be true. It must be there, it must exist. And then based on believing that the I really does exist, we have this attitude of thinking that it's so important, so precious, the center of the world, center of everything. And that is this self-centered attitude, usually called self-cherishing. But you can choose what term you want to use. If self-centeredness or self-importance works better for you, you can use those terms. And we also don't usually question that attitude, the self-centered attitude, but just go along with it. And this might partly be because we observe that everyone else is like that. It's like every person for themselves. So that's the way most people live their lives. And so we think, well, I can be that way too. But we shouldn't think that it's something we have learned from others, like our parents and so on. According to Buddhism, it's already there in our mind when we first come into this world, right from the beginning of our life. And it's there because of past lives. It's been part of the mind all along from beginningless time, as we have seen. The mind didn't start to exist at some point, wasn't created by anyone. It's just always been existing. And as long as it's been existing, it has had this attitude of self-centeredness based on a wrong conception of I, me. So it's like a really old habit. And as we know, it's difficult to give up habits, especially long-term ones. But we shouldn't think that it's impossible, that we can never be free of this attitude of self-centeredness. There are things we can do about it. We can weaken it, learn not to believe in it, buy into it, follow it. And eventually we can get rid of it altogether. We can kick it out of our mind once and for all. So it helps to look at its faults, as we talked about yesterday. See that it's something faulty, it leads to problems for ourselves, for others, short-term, long-term. So in that way, we'll be less likely to think it's good for us and buy into it, follow it. It's also helpful to see the benefits of the opposite state of mind, cherishing others, altruism. And to work on cultivating that state of mind by generating loving kindness and compassion, remembering the kindness of others, altruism, bodhicitta. So working on those methods will weaken self-centeredness. And then tonglen, taking and giving. So see if you can feel that this is worthwhile, a worthwhile endeavor to weaken the self-centered attitude and increase the opposite state of mind, altruism. Another thing that's really helpful is to learn about emptiness, because that is targeting the very sense of I or self that we cherish, that we regard as so precious, so important. So we investigate what exactly is that seemingly real I? What is its nature? How does it exist? Where does it exist? Can I pinpoint it? Can I find something I can point to and say, that is the I right there? So see if you can also feel the wish or the determination to investigate emptiness, to learn about emptiness, how to meditate on it, how to use this idea to weaken both the grasping at a real I and the self-centered attitude that's based on it. So there's a lot of work to do to be completely free of self-centeredness and grasping at an I, but it's worth it. And as we're working on these things, we'll probably be a lot happier. So we'll see the benefit of weakening these attitudes in our mind that have been there for so long, causing us so much suffering and problems. So even to just start to question them and work on antidotes to them is already very, very helpful, very beneficial. Before I go on, there was a question that came up yesterday from Anastasia about is it really necessary to meditate on compassion? I don't know exactly if I got it right, but you felt the wish to put more emphasis on love, loving kindness. And I said there was this passage in Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary to the Chandrakirti's text, Entering the Middle Way. So Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary is called Illuminating the Thought or Illuminating the Intention. We've been receiving teachings on it from Geshe Lundu. Okay. So I found this passage, but I actually got it wrong. I misremembered it. He's actually saying the opposite. He's saying that compassion alone isn't enough, that we need love. So I'll just read that. And so he's throwing out a hypothetical question. Will merely having contemplated how other sentient beings are tormented by suffering and its origin in the cycle of existence induce great compassion? Or does it require some additional complementary factor? So in other words, thinking about how sentient beings are suffering in samsara, and, will that alone induce great compassion, or is something else needed? So Lama Tsongkhapa says something else is needed, because he says, the fact is, when we see an enemy suffering, far from any unbearable feeling, a sense of joy may even arise in its place. Similarly, when we encounter the suffering of someone who has neither benefited nor harmed us, most of the time we are unmoved by their plight. So just meditating on suffering, the suffering of sentient beings, that alone will not induce great compassion for everybody. Because when it comes to our enemies, we might even be happy about their suffering. And when it comes to people we don't have any relation with, then we don't care about them. So he says this happens because we lack, on our part, a sense of holding them dear. In contrast, when we see the suffering of those we love, close kin, we find this unbearable. In fact, the more profoundly we hold someone dear, it seems, the more intense the feeling of unbearableness. Thus, the essential point is how we need to generate a sense of endearment toward other sentient beings, a deep regard for them, cherishing them in our heart. So here he's saying that generating that, I mean, he's not using the word love, but that's the idea, is to see others as close and have affection for them, endearment for them. And then he goes on to talk about 2 ways to generate this sense of endearment. And one is contemplating that all sentient beings have been parents and so forth from beginningless time. And so that's this method, the 7-point method that we've been looking at, the 7-point cause and effect method. And then the second approach, he says, is the tradition of glorious Shantideva. This I have explained elsewhere, so please understand it from there. So that's the one we were looking at yesterday, the equalizing and exchanging self for others. So he's saying there's those 2 methods that enable us to generate a sense of endearment towards other sentient beings, and that is needed to complement contemplating suffering. Yeah, so just seeing how sentient beings are suffering, that alone will not necessarily bring up this wish to free them from suffering. We need to do the others as well. So I got it wrong. So I just wanted to clear that up. It was backwards. But I can't help but think that if Lama Tsongkhapa were to ask the other question, is love alone enough? If you just generate a sense of endearment and love for sentient beings, thinking about their kindness and so on, will that alone be enough to generate this great compassion and then bodhicitta and the wish to become enlightened, to help all of them? So, I don't know. I kind of think he would say, no, you do need to meditate on their suffering, realize how they're suffering, and that will give you this strong energy to, move along the path and get to enlightenment as quickly as possible. So I may be wrong, but that's just my guess.
Well, I remember when Geshe Tashi Tsering taught this, he taught that the wholehearted resolve is also a type of great compassion. So since we need that, we need great compassion to lead to the wholehearted resolve.
Yeah. I think to go all the way to bodhicitta, whichever method you're using to generate bodhicitta, I think both love and compassion are needed. But, at different times in your practice, you may feel more inclined to focus on one. You may feel you're deficient in one or the other, and you want to put more energy into that. Just as long as, eventually you do the other meditations as well, focus on those as well. So we spent quite a bit of time looking at one of the 2 methods, with the 7-point cause and effect method. And then yesterday, just briefly looking at the other method of equalizing and exchanging self and others, which has 5 points. And people naturally wonder, which one should I use? So I'll just read something from this book, In Praise of Great Compassion, what His Holiness says, a kind of comparison of the 2 methods. He says, the equalizing and exchanging self and others method for generating bodhicitta is more suitable for sharp faculty disciples because it employs reasoning to establish others' equality. So that's what they say, that for I'm not completely sure what the meaning of sharp faculty is. It sounds like those who are smarter, more intelligent. But one of my teachers explained that it isn't necessarily a question of intelligence, but it's more a question of energy. Like sharp faculty practitioners are those who have a lot of drive, a lot of energy. They're really, determined to follow the path. And then there's others who are less like that. So I don't know, there may be different interpretations of that term. But yeah, they do say that equalizing and exchanging self for others is suitable for sharp faculties, people. And then he says, in the 7 cause and effect instructions, our fondness and compassion for sentient beings arises based on our family relationships and how family members have acted toward us personally, the kindness they have shown to us as our relatives. Yeah, so could be that for some people that works better. If you do have close family relations, you have good feelings, for example, good relations with your parents, and you can really see the value of, parents and others who've taken care of you and been kind to you and so on. So if that's easy for you, then maybe that technique works better because it's tapping into something you already experience. And then you're just extending that same feeling to others, realizing, oh, they have also been my parents and so on. And then he says, equalizing and exchanging self and others does not require seeing ourselves as having been the recipient of kindness in a privileged relationship with sentient beings in the past. So rather, we connect with them on a more fundamental level. Each of us wants happiness and not suffering. Thus, this method enables us to see the kindness of enemies without first transforming their appearance into someone pleasing, such as a relative. So we don't immediately have to think about, oh, this enemy has been my parent, has been kind to me, and so on and so forth. But just the fact that they want happiness just like me, that sameness of myself and that person, that can transform our mind towards them. And then he goes on to say, the reasoning used by equalizing and exchanging self and others also brings in an understanding of the ultimate truth, emptiness. What we designate I and cherish, and what we call other and neglect, is not based on some inherent nature that I and others have. So that's talking about emptiness and how oneself and others and all phenomena are empty of some inherent nature, some intrinsic, solid, real nature in and of themselves. And he says, I and others are dependent on each other. They are also seen as mere designations, which loosens our grasping at self. For these reasons, equalizing and exchanging self and others is seen as a more profound method that is directed toward disciples with sharp faculties. So I was thinking to make that a little more clear, I'll go through the 9 points I mentioned yesterday when we were going through this method of equalizing and exchanging self for others. The first of those points is called equalizing self and others, and that mainly involves recognizing we all are the same and wanting happiness. And I mentioned that there are these 9 points that elaborate on that idea. And I thought maybe we wouldn't have time to go through them, but I think we do. So I'll just go through them now. I know some of you have heard them before. I think Venerable Children probably went through them when she was teaching Shantideva, but probably some of you haven't. So I'll go through these, and these They say it was Trichang Rinpoche, who was His Holiness the Dalai Lama's junior tutor. He had a senior tutor, Ling Rinpoche, and a junior tutor, Trichang Rinpoche. Both of them have passed away. But yeah, they say it was Trichang Rinpoche who taught these 9 points, but I don't know if he just made them up and created them himself or they came from somewhere else, but they are quite interesting. And I'm using, they use sort of traditional Tibetan examples, so I've changed the examples to more contemporary ones that we could relate to better, maybe. Okay, so they're divided into 3 groups, and the first 3 points contain reasons related to others. So all these 9 points are using reasoning. We're reasoning with our mind in order to see, good reasons for cherishing others rather than neglecting them. So it's using reasoning rather than just emotions. So the first 3 contain reasons related to others. The first one is what we've already seen, that every being has the same wish to be happy and free from suffering. So is it right to discriminate among them and wish only some of them to be happy and free of pain, but not others? So we contemplate that point, that it's not kind of easy to understand that every person, every living being wants to be happy, just like me. And they don't want to suffer, just like me. That's kind of not too difficult to understand. So we contemplate that and ask ourselves, so if that's the case, if we all have that same wish to be happy and not suffer, then is it right to discriminate and wish only this group of people, this small group of people, to be happy and not others? So we reason with ourselves in that way. And then the other 2 points here are more like examples to help us get a deeper sense of that. And again, I'm using contemporary examples rather than the traditional ones. So the second point is, let's say you're volunteering in a food bank or in a famine relief program, and there are 10 hungry people standing in front of you. You're passing out food, and there's 10 people that are all hungry, all in need of food. Would it be right to discriminate and give food only to some of them and not to others? You'd probably lose your job if you, you're a volunteer. But anyway, you'd probably get kicked out if you did that. So we kind of just know that that wouldn't be right. If they're all hungry, they all need food, it wouldn't be right to give food only to some and not to others. Especially if we put ourselves on the other side of that. And if we were one of those 10 people and we got passed over, no, I'm not going to give you any food. I'll give it to this person. That would be pretty cruel. And then the third point is another example. Imagine you are a doctor with 10 people in your waiting room who are all suffering from flu. Would it be right to take care of some of them and not the others? So again, I think that gets easy to recognize. That just wouldn't be the right thing to do. So those 2 points are more like examples that help us get a stronger sense of how it's just not right to discriminate and only help and care about some individuals and then neglect others, not care about them. So those 3 reasons are related to others. The next 3 are related to oneself. I was going to make a slide of these, but my internet is down, so I thought if I make a slide, I wouldn't be able to send it. But I can, I guess some of the information I've put together, I was already sent to you or given to you. But I can also, put these together and give that to you before you leave. So don't worry about writing it all down. I'll give it to you before you leave. And then, okay, so these three are related to ourself. So the fourth point is, since everything we have and enjoy, our body, food, clothes, car, house, knowledge, skills, and so on. So all the things we have in our life, all the things we use, all the things we enjoy come from others. Other people have produced those things and made them available to us. Then is it right to ignore them and focus only on our own happiness? So here it's contemplating the kindness we have received from others. And if we really see that, recognize that, and then ask ourselves, so is that right to not do anything helpful in return to them? So isn't it right that we should feel grateful and try to repay their kindness? Then point number 5 is, in case our mind comes up with the objection, okay, yes, they've been kind to me, but they've also harmed me. Yeah. And this is true. So just as, in our past lives, everyone's been our mother and our father and friend and doctor and provider of food and so on. So yes, everyone has been in that kind of role in relation to us. But it's also true that they have been our enemy and we have received suffering in relation to them. So Buddhism does acknowledge that. Yeah. And even in this life, we've received a lot of harm and suffering from other people. Okay, so we're not denying that we have been harmed by others, and we have also harmed them. We've also done harmful things to them. But the kindness outweighs the harm they have done. So if we compare the kindness we've received from others when they've been our mother and father and so on, and the harm we've received from them, the kindness is greater, stronger. And I think you could see that in your relations with your parents in this life. There were times they got angry and they may have yelled at us and punished us and hit us. But how often did that happen compared with how often were they kind and loving and provided us with food and all these other things? So I think in most cases, except for some parents who may be abusive, but I think those are the exception rather than the norm. So I think most of the time, the kindness we receive from others, like our parents, is far greater than any harm we may have received. I used to be very cynical about this, like I mentioned before, that human beings are so horrible, cruel, and so on. But I've changed. And I think if we just think about the interactions that take place between human beings on this planet on a daily basis, there's probably billions or trillions of interactions where, one person interacts with another person in all different ways, within families, but also, at workplaces and shopping centers and traveling and so forth. So there's a lot of interaction between human beings. And if we think about that, I think most of those interactions are non-harmful and often very friendly. People are generally friendly to each other and looking out for each other, caring for each other. They see somebody who needs help, somebody will step in and help them. And even if they're not necessarily friendly, they're at least not harmful, because there's always that opportunity. Every time two human beings come together, they could harm each other. They could kill each other or yell at each other or say hurtful things. They could harm each other, but I think most of the time they don't. Yeah? Do you agree with me? It's rare. It's unusual for human beings to harm each other. That's why it's in the news. I mean, this is one problem, the news tends to focus on those kind of activities. When somebody kills somebody, there's a murder, there's a school shooting, terrorist act, or whatever. That makes big news. But that's because it's unusual. It's kind of, wow, shocking. But the everyday interactions, moms and dads getting their kids out of bed and getting them dressed and fed and taking them off to school, and then teachers, teaching the kids at school and the students playing with each other. I mean, most of the time people don't do harmful things to each other, but that's so normal that it doesn't make the news. I mean, if the news talked about that, everybody would be bored. Nobody would want to watch the news. It's just normal. People kind of like the exciting things, the, shocking things. So that's what's covered on the news. So we have to remember that when we pay attention to the news, that, they're focusing on the bad stuff, the horrible stuff, the shocking stuff. And that's unusual. That's rare. But most of human interactions, I don't know if anyone's ever done research on this, but I think if they did, have they done research?
It made me think of a book I've read called Factfully. It was by a researcher, Swedish researcher, I think. He started a foundation to research this very point in many different areas, like all around the world. He's since passed away, but I think that organization is still going on, and you can go online and look at graphs and charts.
What's it called?
I'm not sure what the organization is called, but the book was called Factfully.
Factfully.
Yeah, Fully, like he looking at the actual
factfully.
facts.
Yeah.
I think it probably had a tagline, but I don't remember what that was.
Yeah. And so he did research into, crime versus
poverty, hunger, all different kinds of humanitarian efforts.
I mean, it's not to deny that there is a lot of harmful things and injustice and horrible things going on. We're not denying that. But, just in case you do get this idea, like I used to, that, human beings are just horrible all the time. And there's no real love and compassion. I think that's a very distorted view. I think there's a great deal of love and compassion and kindness and non-harmfulness, just plain non-harmfulness between human beings. So it's good to focus on that and realize, that is there. And it's probably more prevalent than the harmful things. So anyway, with regard to this point, yes, it is true we have been harmed by others in this life and past lives, but comparatively, relatively, there's less harm than there is kindness and help. And also because what we're trying to generate here are positive attitudes towards others. So is it helpful to keep thinking about the harm we've received from others? Get obsessed with that and ignore the kindness that we've received. So if we focus too much on the harm, then that isn't going to help us generate kindness and compassion. I mean, we may need to go through some processing if we have received harm and we're still wounded by that, traumatized by that. Then if we need to receive help from therapists or meditation or whatever, we do need to heal those wounds, but not to just be obsessed with that harm and then think only of that and not of their kindness. So for the purpose of our goal, where we're trying to get to, we're trying to have good feelings for others, then it's more useful to focus on their kindness and help. Okay, then, next point is, this is number 6, we are all impermanent. Ourselves and all other beings are impermanent, and we are subject to death. We're all going to die. So given that, is there any point in discriminating against anyone or clinging to old resentments? So a way you might get a sense of this, if you were to imagine yourself in an airplane with a lot of other people, and you run into turbulence, and, you know, in those situations, we start thinking about death, you know, maybe the plane's going to crash. And so in that situation, would it make sense to start picking fights with fellow passengers over small things like, you know, keep your elbow on your side. Don't stick it on my armrest, or, you know, things like that. I mean, some people might do that, but I think, you know, in that kind of situation, I remember seeing this film once. It was a really funny film. I don't know if it was a true story or not, but it was about this band, this music group. And they were traveling around doing shows here and there, and they were in this little airplane, and suddenly they ran into turbulence. And they were like, you know, and then they all started apologizing to each other, making up for their quarrels and this and that. So I think that's probably what we're more inclined to do when we're faced with that kind of situation, you know. We want to clear out that stuff in our mind, old resentments, arguments, and so on. So I think that that's the point here, that yeah, we're all going to die. This life isn't going to last forever. We're all heading for death. And thinking about that, contemplating that, does it make sense to hang on to little problems with other people, you know, especially small things, and die with anger and resentment in our mind? Or would we like to clear those things out and free ourselves of them before we die? Yeah, I was teaching a course last year. It was an online course on death and dying and how to prepare for death. And one of the participants was a woman. I think she's actually a student of the Abbey, does safe courses here at the Abbey. And her father was dying. And so she was doing this course to learn, you know, how to be with her father and help her father and so on. And then I heard later that she was also worried about her father's state of mind. She wanted him to be in a good state of mind when he died, and wanted to, you know, help him. And then I heard later that it seems just spontaneously, before her father died, he just started having these really positive thoughts and feelings. He called up a brother that he hadn't talked to for years and years and years. And, you know, they had this, anyway, bad relationship, called him up and apologized. And yeah, he was reaching out to all these people that he had, you know, not such good relationships with, and, you know, clearing those things up. And I think, you know, without her having to suggest that to him, it just came up in his own mind, and he did that. And apparently he was really in a good state of mind when he died. So that's ideal, if we can do that, and not wait till the last minute. It's better to do it now. So if we do see the value in having a positive state of mind when we die, then yeah, we shouldn't hang on to these problems with other people, holding a grudge against them, resentment towards them, and so on and so forth. Try to clear up those problems as much as possible. And if possible, don't even let them happen in the first place. Try not to get into those kind of quarrels with people. So those are the first 6 reasons. The first 3 are related to others. The second 3 are related to oneself. And then the last 3 reasons, and those first 6 reasons are related to conventional truth, how things exist conventionally, everyday reality. And the last 3 are from the viewpoint of ultimate truth, how things are empty of inherent existence. So number 7 is, there are no inherently existing friends or enemies. No one is a friend or enemy from their own side. if they were, then the Buddhas would perceive them as such, because we believe the Buddhas see things correctly as they really are, without any mistake. So if there really was an inherently existing friend over here and an inherently existing enemy over there, if they existed like that from their own side, objectively, the Buddhas would see them that way. They would see this person as a friend and this person as an enemy. But that's not the case. From the point of view of a Buddha, there's no such thing as friend and enemy. Everyone is seen equally as dear and precious. Let me see, like a mother, the way a mother views all her children. She loves all of them equally, dearly. And also, even not bringing in a Buddha, but just bringing other people, other human beings. If there really was an inherently existing friend who's so lovable and wonderful and fantastic, everybody would feel that way about that person. Everyone would see that person as a friend, but that's not the case. Even we don't always see that person as a friend. Sometimes they appear as an enemy to us, depending on our state of mind. And the same with the enemy. They seem to be like really bad and horrible and unlovable, impossible to like, impossible to get along with from their side objectively. But if that was really the case, then everyone else would feel that way as well. And there might be some people who feel that way too, but for sure there are people who don't and who love that person, especially that person's mother. Yeah, you can always think of mothers because, most mothers go on loving their children no matter what they do. So even if they turn into criminals or terrorists or do horrible, horrible things, the mothers still love them and care for them and want to help them. So there's always at least one person in the world who loves that person and cares about that person, sees that person as lovable, dear. So those are also thoughts that can help us recognize there's no inherently existing friend or enemy. The next point, number 8, is if there were permanent, inherently existing friends, enemies, and strangers, they would be like that forever and would never change. So those relationships we have with them would be permanent, unchangeable. But we can see in our own examples and also in other people's experience that relationships can change. Friends can become enemies, enemies can become friends, and so on. This can happen from one life to another, but also even within one life. And it's due to many factors, causes, conditions, and our minds. What is going on in our mind, how we perceive others, how we label them. That reminds me, there was this story that I heard. I met this young man, this was many years ago, and he told me he had been living in North Idaho. I had never been to this part of the world, but he said he was living in North Idaho, and one day he and some friends were driving in a remote area, and it was winter, lots of snow, and their car broke down. And they didn't have what they needed to fix it, so they were kind of stuck there on the road. And another car came along with some guys in the car, and they stopped, and they said, "Oh, get in, we'll take you to our place." And I don't remember if they were going to just take them there so they could call. This was before the days of mobile phones, so you have to get somewhere to get to a phone and call AAA or whatever. So they got into the car with these guys and went to their place where they lived, and it turned out they were members of Aryan Nation. They were people with certain views, and they also, did a number of very unpleasant things. So their headquarters were somewhere near Hayden, just nearby, not far from here. And so this young man found himself in their camp. And he'd heard of them, of course, but I don't remember the whole story. They did help him out. They helped him and his friend to get their car fixed and get back on the road. But that's just like an example of how, you may have ideas about a person or a group of people thinking, oh, they're really horrible. They have these horrible views and they do horrible things. But everybody does have some kindness. So these Aryan Nation members did help out this young man and his friends so that they could, carry on with their journey. And I use that kind of idea when I'm doing meditation, like the equanimity meditation, friend, enemy, stranger, with regard to the enemy, person I don't like. I try to imagine a situation like that, if my car broke down on the road and I didn't know how to fix it, and somebody comes along and helps me, and that person happens to be my enemy, somebody I don't like. So I think my mind would definitely change, would soften. And again, that doesn't mean we're condoning wrong that they've done, ignoring that, pretending that didn't happen. We can still condemn that kind of behavior. But when it comes to the person, understand this is another person, another human being like me. They want to be happy. They don't want to suffer. They have a mixture of all kinds of different attitudes and behaviors. Some are not good, I don't agree with. But they also have these other qualities that are good and positive. So just to be able to open up our mind more and not hang on to negative feelings. So I think, anytime we're in a situation where we're in need of help and somebody shows up and gives us the help that we need, I think even if that person is someone we don't like, that would change our feelings towards them. Hard to go on hating someone when they help you out, offer you a hand. Okay, last point, number 9, is if we cling to permanent, inherently existing friends and enemies, like this person's going to be my friend forever, this person is my enemy forever. So this is like having fixed ideas of this side and that side. So, for example, if we're standing on one side of a road, then we call it this side, and we're looking over there at the other side and calling it that side. So when we're here, this side is this side and that side is that side. But if we cross the road and we're standing over there, then that side becomes this side and this side becomes that side. Does that make sense? I mean, they use it in the traditional teachings. They talk about mountains. If you're on this mountain, then you think this mountain and that mountain and so on. But not all of us have the chance to stand on top of mountains. So roads is something more common. So these kind of labels depend on our perspective, where we're at, where we're standing. And a similar thing happens with people. For example, if there's this person who has the same political beliefs that we do, then we feel they're on my side. And then someone who has other views is the other side, us and them. But to understand that this kind of labeling isn't permanent, because people can change their views. So somebody who's on this side today or this year, maybe they'll change over to the other side next year, and then they become that side. And somebody who's over on that side this year changes and becomes on this side. So just to see how these kind of labels are not permanent and fixed, but depend on circumstances, like people changing their minds, changing their views, changing their lifestyle. Yeah. Just like with where we're standing and looking out, then we give different labels to different places. And then in a similar way, we label I in relation to this body and mind. Okay, so this collection of aggregates, body-mind combination. We say I, and then with regard to other bodies and minds, we say them, he, she, they, and so on. So it's just because of where we happen to be. But then from their point of view, it's the opposite. Each of those other people say I in relation to their body and mind. And from their point of view, we are other. We are, someone else. So we're just all these body-mind combinations, and we give different labels to them, depending on where we're at. When we're over here, we're I, and others are over there, them. So the point is, these kind of labels like I and other, and also friend, enemy, stranger, these are just labels, names that we apply to different people depending on circumstances that can change. And they're not things that exist inherently from their own side. And if we work on our mind and use reasons to understand things like others want to be happy just like me, they are human beings, living beings with a mind and a body. They're just trying to stay alive, trying to keep themselves happy and healthy. So basically just like me. And it really breaks down this solid sense of I over here and others over there who are so different, so far from me. So it helps us to see greater sameness. So I think to these last 3 points, the more you have an understanding of emptiness, selflessness, then the more these would make sense and be helpful to engender this feeling of equality of oneself and others, rather than a strong sense of separation. Solid I over here, solid others over there, as if we're totally disconnected and have no relationship at all. So I think this is an illustration of what His Holiness was saying, that this method of equalizing and exchanging self for others relies more on reasoning, using reasoning to change our attitudes rather than just thinking in terms of emotions. I mean, that one uses reasoning too, some reasoning, but it does seem to appeal more to our sense of, yeah, I should care about this person because they have been helpful to me. So I think we can, use both methods. We don't have to just stick to one. I think most people in our tradition will learn both methods and meditate on them alternatively, because they all have value. They're all helpful. And in fact, there's this method that combines. The next slide shows the combined method that combines the two together. So this is a combination. So we've already covered all of these individually, but this is how you can put them together. I think it was Lama Tsongkhapa who did this. I'm not sure, but anyway. So first is equanimity, equalizing friend, enemy, stranger. And then 2 is seeing all sentient beings as having been your mother. 3, remembering their kindness, both when they were your mother and in other ways. So contemplating all the different ways we have received kindness from others. And then 4th, wishing to repay their kindness. So those are like the first 4 points from the first method, the 7-point method. Then it jumps to the other method. So point 5 is equalizing self and others, which we just went through, mainly realizing that everyone is the same and wanting to be happy and not suffer. And then 6, disadvantages of self-centeredness. 7 benefits of cherishing others. And then 8, exchanging self and others, meaning exchanging our priorities from being self-centered, obsessed with I, me, to being altruistic, more concerned with others. And then Tonglen. So Tonglen is divided up here. Number 9 is taking others' suffering with compassion. And 10, giving your happiness to others with love. And then 11 is the great resolve. That's another way of saying, what did we call it before? Extraordinary intention. That's where you take on the responsibility of, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do what it takes to ensure that sentient beings are free of suffering and that they have happiness. And the next point, I didn't put it here, but it's like a 12th point. The 12th point is Bodhicitta itself. So that arises from having contemplated all these other points over a long period of time, really getting familiar with them. Then Bodhicitta arises because you realize that if we do want to help sentient beings, we got to work on ourselves. We got to change ourselves and bring ourselves to enlightenment, because as a Buddha, then we do have the ability to fulfill that wish of helping others. And I've seen different versions of this combined method in Pabonko Rinpoche, Liberation in the Palm of the Hand. He has a slightly different way of enumerating them. But anyway, I think all the points are there. So this is kind of convenient if you want to get the best of both of those two methods.
So I have a clarifying question on Tonglen. And so sometimes I kind of struggled with understanding what exactly am I taking upon myself and what am I giving. So, for example, if there's someone I know right now who is very old and suffering from dementia, and then I'm like kind of confused, do I take his mental state upon me, or do I take the suffering he has upon me? Because so here I find it very clear, and so I would take the suffering upon me, but I wouldn't kind of give up my clarity of mind. And so for me, sometimes there was like kind of confusion.
Yeah. No, I think in a really expanded version, then we take on their suffering and the causes of suffering. So you would take on not just the present suffering they're having, but the karma, the affliction. So we want to take everything that is problematic for the other person. So we do, if you're able to do that. But yeah, there's a lot of confusion about Tonglen because, people naturally wonder, does that mean that the person's suffering is really going to come into me and I'm going to have it? And that makes it scarier. Like, yeah, do you really want to get dementia? So there's different ways of understanding that. I mean, in some traditions they say that you should have the willingness, you should have such strong compassion and love that you are willing, if you could, to take that person's suffering onto yourself and experience it yourself so they don't have to experience it. So there needs to be that willingness, but in reality, they say it's actually not possible. Most of the time, in most cases, it's not actually possible for one person to take away another person's suffering, because each person, we create karma that is the cause of our own suffering. And so each person is responsible for their own suffering, and no one else can take it away from them, because if that was possible, the Buddha would have already taken away all our suffering and all our karma and all our afflictions, and we'd be totally enlightened by now. That's what the Buddha wants to do, but it's not possible. So even a Buddha can't do that. So of course, if we're not Buddhas, we can't do it either. However, they do say that, there's some anecdotes of cases where Like there was one lama who, somebody who was beating a dog or something like that. And this lama just felt so much compassion for the dog and did the Tonglen practice. And then he got a bruise on his leg. Yeah, something like that. He did actually get some result on his own body of doing the practice of taking away the suffering. So they say, what I've heard is, if you have a strong karmic connection with another person, it might happen that you can take the suffering away from them. I don't fully understand how that works, but apparently that's rare. That's like an exception. Normally it doesn't happen. But we still have, ideally, we do have the wish to take on their suffering and experience it. But literally, it isn't something that will literally happen. Does that make sense? No? You don't look convinced.
I do understand that in reality, I'm not afraid of, actually exchanging something. But it's, even if I'm just kind of imagining, like, what exactly am I taking and what exactly am I giving? And it might not make sense, but if I imagine myself kind of taking the pain, the emotional aspect, this kind of works for my mind. But if I'm imagining, I don't know, like if I'm imagining taking more like maybe the wrong view upon myself or the confusion, it's more difficult. It's like,
But remember, in the visualization, when you are doing this imagination of taking the person's suffering and causes of suffering in the form of smoke or whatever, you're taking it in and then putting it on your self-cherishing attitude, which gets destroyed, but the suffering also. I mean, there may be different ways of explaining it, but the way I understand it is the suffering doesn't stay there. So you're not actually taking it on and then you're stuck with it, like the dementia or the wrong views or whatever. You're not, then you're, having that. But everything gets destroyed, both the suffering you're taking from the other person and the self-cherishing or self-centered attitude that you're trying to target. Both of those are annihilated. Has anyone heard another way of explaining it? I mean, that's how I've heard it. Does Venerable explain it that way as well? It all disappears. It's all gone. Yeah? So that's what you're supposed to think. You're supposed to imagine and visualize. And then you focus on all the good qualities you have, your good karma, your qualities, as well as, they say, your body, your resources, so all the good stuff you have, and you imagine that in some kind of form. Very beautiful, very nice, and then you send that out to them and imagine them receiving it. Again, most probably they won't be able to receive it, but the real purpose of this practice is not to change the other person, to bring about a change in the other person, because most of we can't do that. It's to change our mind. We're trying to work on our mind so that we have less self-centeredness and more altruism, more concern for others. That's the goal, and that's what we can accomplish.
I was just going to say, I haven't heard it described another way, but for me, another thing, it's a subsidiary thing it's helped, is it's sort of like practicing the antidotes in a way, or they get into your mind. And I've found when maybe I have pain, then you're thinking of kind of the opposite thing. So I don't know that that's supposed to be the case, but it sticks in my mind. So if I think, oh, I have pain, and I start to get self-centered, I kind of think of the opposite thing sometimes. And I don't know if that makes any sense.
You mean like what we were talking about yesterday, that instead of focusing on your pain, you're focusing on compassion, wanting to help others, and that itself is very healing.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because I mean, it's hard not to focus on pain when there is pain, when there's suffering in yourself. And so we do tend to get kind of obsessed with that. But the more we focus on our pain, then the more it can build up and seem worse even than it really is, like making a mountain out of a molehill. Yeah. And there's probably going to be other thoughts as well, like, oh, poor me, and isn't this awful, and how long is it going to last, and all these kind of thoughts that just make it worse rather than better. So instead of getting caught up in those kinds of thoughts, thinking about others, turning our attention to others and their suffering. And one thing that becomes obvious is they have a lot more suffering than we do. Whatever problem we have, others have too, but many have even worse than ours. So that really alleviates this tendency to focus on our own problem. Then it seems bearable rather than unbearable. Something I can manage rather than something it's over.
Venerable, I taught my dad on this Tonglen practice when he was going through an operation. I told him that nevertheless, you also need to go through operation and remove it. Why not that you have this compassion on others? He was the one who shared with me that there is a psychological effect when he was thinking of other sentient beings that experiencing the same problem. And then he feels that he doesn't actually focus on, I am actually experiencing a pain, because everybody is the same. Mm-hmm. And then he mentioned that after the operation, he feels this bliss of light, that is less pain, less focus on, the constraint of like, I'm experiencing a pain. Mm-hmm. And I think that is actually evolution of elimination of self-centeredness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It is possible. So again, the main purpose of doing the practice is to change our own mind, and we can't expect to change others, what's going on out there. But I remember reading an article about this woman who did the Tonglen practice, and she would do it in business meetings at her office. So when things were getting kind of tense and nasty and so on, she would quietly, I mean, nobody knew she was doing it, but she would imagine taking on all this bad energy and sending out good energy. And it did have an effect. People did become calmer. And she mentioned that one of her colleagues seemed to notice that as well, because one time she was walking down the hall and met a couple of colleagues who were coming the other way, and they asked her if she was coming to the meeting. And they said, when you're there, things go better. Something like that. So that shows that it could have an effect if we do this practice. It might change the energy in others.
To what extent should we aim to do this meditation in actual practice? Because, for example, I can give up a window seat for a middle seat on an airplane very easily, but giving up my life for something is a little bit harder to do.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of stories of Buddha's past life, where he many past lives. It's called the Jataka tales. So while he was a bodhisattva on his way to enlightenment, he had many, many lifetimes, and often he would sacrifice his life, give his life to others, and also other stories of Buddhist practitioners over the ages who did amazing acts of self-sacrifice and so on. But they do say in the teachings that we shouldn't do that kind of thing until our compassion is very strong. I can't remember the exact criteria, whether you have to already have uncontrived bodhicitta, or at least very, very firm and strong compassion in your mind. So, because it's so rare and precious to have a human life, a precious human rebirth, we have all the conditions to be able to practice. And if we were to, give it up, lose it, if our practice is really strong, it's not certain where we would go, where we would be reborn, and we may not have such an ideal condition in our next life. So so we shouldn't just like for no good reason give up our life. Yeah. So there are these stories you probably heard. I don't know if this is still going on, but a lot of Tibetans burning themselves, immolating, self-immolation. Is that still happening? For a number of years, they were doing that in protest against the Chinese occupation of Tibet. And I heard the Dalai Lama was in a really difficult position because if he were to come out and say, stop doing that, don't do that, I think generally, within Buddhism, that is not recommended. It's not recommended to burn yourself, lose your life so easily. But then it would have been complicated if he said that, because then the families of those who did do that might feel, oh, what that person did was wrong. So but generally, it's not a good idea to give up your life until your mind is quite firm and stable, and you can be sure that where you go in your next life, you will be able to continue practicing. So they say in the beginning we can give small things. Shantideva says something about that. I think he's more addressing people's fear. When people hear about the bodhisattvas making these incredible sacrifices, and they think, oh, is that what I have to do? And feel scared about that. And he says something like, start by giving material things like vegetables. And later, when you're able to see your own body like a vegetable, in the sense that, you're not attached to it. It's just a mass of cells and molecules and atoms, and you don't have this strong attachment to it. Then you can give your body. But isn't it something like that? I don't know which chapter that was in. But yeah, do you remember that? Yeah. So it's not something required of us in the beginning. So it's having strong bodhicitta and compassion, but also understanding of emptiness and selflessness. So we need to build those up. And
I remember hearing something about how this Tonglen practice was secret for quite a while. I think because people often got the wrong impression, or your mind needs to be really stable. Can you speak to that?
yes, I think, the tradition or the lineage, it did. I think the basis of the practice is in one of Nagarjuna's texts, some line in one of his texts where he talks about something to do with taking on the suffering and giving happiness to others. So that's the origin of the practice. Maybe there's something in the sutras as well, I'm not sure. But anyway, the practice came into Tibet with Atisha, the great master, Indian master, who received all these different teachings and lineages and brought them to Tibet. And I think in the beginning, he taught it to some of his disciples, and then they would pass it on to their disciples. So it was kept not secret so much, but just restricted. It wasn't taught openly, publicly, because it was hard. It was felt that it's hard for most people to do. And then one of the Kadampa masters, that's the kind of an early community of practitioners who were followers of Atisha. One of those was named Geshe Chekawa, and he learned this practice. And it's what I heard is he taught it to some people who were suffering from leprosy. And they did the practice, and some of them were cured of their leprosy. And he thought, wow, this is great. We should make this more available. So he wrote this text called a 7-point mind training. One very famous mind training text. And this practice is included in that. And then he would teach it more openly, more publicly to large groups of people. So he's the one who brought it out of the closet and made it more available. And so since that time, it has been more available. But still, yeah, I mean, there are people, like I say, who hear about the practice and just, I don't want to do that. I can't do that. So it isn't for everybody. But on the other hand, there are people who really love it right from the beginning. Maybe they practiced it in past lives, or they just have a very strong sense of altruism. So it is, kind of a tricky practice. And I think people should only do the practice when they're comfortable to do so and not force themselves. And it's also nice that there are these instructions that if you do feel uncomfortable or frightened of doing it, then start with yourself, start with your own suffering. And that makes complete sense to me, because if we can't even take on our own suffering, when we have a problem, when we have some unpleasant thing happening in our life, if we freak out and we can't manage it, how can we possibly take on the suffering of anybody else? So it really makes sense to start gradually in that way and learn to be able to manage your own problems, your own suffering first, and then gradually get used to that, and then start imagining it with others. Does that make sense? Venerable Pema Chodron has kind of made it famous. She teaches it a lot, and it's in her books. So it's kind of become famous in the West. It's not really secret so much anymore.
I think I remember Venerable Chodron saying that there's another version of doing this practice regarding yourself. It's taking on the suffering of you in the future.
Yeah.
Or you and maybe even in the past. Is that a legitimate practice?
Yeah, that's what the teachings say in the instructions. They say it's good to start with your own suffering and think about the suffering you will experience in the future. Yesterday, I spoke about it in response, with regard to present suffering, when you're experiencing a problem right here and now. But yeah, the traditional teachings are to imagine what you're going to go through in your future as your body is getting older, and you'll probably get sick and eventually you'll die. So imagining your future suffering and then doing the Tonglen practice, taking that on now and using it to annihilate the self-centered attitude. So doing the same visualization, but it's your suffering that's going to happen in the future. So you could easily spend a lot of time doing that, just your own suffering. But yeah, to me that makes a lot of sense, to learn how to do it with your own suffering and problems, and then do it with others' suffering. Not that you might want to, even in the beginning stages, do it with others' suffering, especially if there's someone who's really in pain or dying or confused or depressed, and you really want to help that person. Yeah. So you could do the practice with them. So each person needs to check their own mind and situation, what they're able to do, and do it accordingly. Okay, so we'll stop there. So this afternoon, I was hoping to start looking at this text by Nagarjuna this morning, but I'll do it this afternoon. It's really nice.